I grew up in a world in which, for decades, there was 1/6 of the world, by the year 2000, 1 billion people, who had 80% of the world's income. And then there were 5 billion people who are in the so-called developing world that had 20% of the global income. So much so that as we look out, the so-called 80-20 that I and my contemporaries grew up with is now looking at a very, very different future. It is the future that you will face. It is a future of 9 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. Of the 3 billion extra that have been added to the planet, or will be added to the planet from the year 2000, about 100 million goes to the rich countries, and 2.9 billion goes to the developing countries. So come 2050, it's not 1 billion and 5 billion, it's 1.1 billion and 8 billion, or close to it. That is a huge change, dramatic change. The other consequential change is that the structure of the economy is being driven both by the population development and also by modern technology, which has allowed the conveyance of ideas and innovation to move to the developing world. And so the projections today are that that old 80-20 with which I grew up for decades will become 35-65. 35% for the 1 billion in the rich countries, and 65% for the people in the developing countries. That is turning the world on its head in terms of the world that I grew up in.
China might become a larger economy than the United States a lot quicker than people think. Is that the case?
That's right. Nobody seems to have picked this up. The IMF dropped a bombshell sometime, I think, in the last week, very quietly on their website, and no one seems to have picked this up. They have now put out a forecast of when the Chinese economy will overtake that of the United States. When you talk to a lot of Wall Street economists and talking heads, they will tell you, oh, it's decades away and all that stuff. Nonsense. It is 5 years' time, 2016.
But it is the world that you're going to work in. And it is not a trivial change. It is a change of monumental importance. So much so that by 2050, China and India, the two countries that I have, of course, the leading countries in the developing world, will constitute 50% of the global GDP. 50% of the global GDP. That is the consensus estimate. But let's say we're off 5%, it's 45% of the global GDP. It's nonetheless a monumental switch in terms of economic power. Recently, till we had this crisis, the United States had a sort of 10 trillion consumption. European Union had 9. And Asia and the rest of the developing world had a little less than $5 trillion. So it was 10, 9, 5. And the middle class in the world, of whom there are today, or a couple of years ago, was 1.5 billion roughly in the middle class. 1 billion was in the rich countries, in that group that I spoke of. And about $500 million in the middle class, characterized as incomes of between $10 and $100 per capita per week. That this amount of money was demonstrated to be heavily leveraged to those richer countries. By 2030, the estimate now is that there will be 3 billion people in the middle class, and of that 3 billion, 2/3 of it will be in Asia. 2/3 of it. So this is a switch from being a fraction, being less than a third, to being 2/3. And that is a pretty dramatic shift. You'll have a middle class in China of 1 billion people. Billion people by 2050. Middle class. So these are not trivial changes in the outlook. These are tectonic shifts in terms of the way the planet works. And as I said to you, as I look at all of you, in my generation, we didn't have to think about that. In the Dean's generation, it was 80-20 or 78-22 or something like that. It was a balance where you knew you were the rich countries, the powerful countries, and all the organs of running the world were designed to accommodate that fact. Because in Africa, of the 800 or 900 million people that are now there, that will grow to 2 billion people by 2050. 2 billion out of 9 billion. And the estimates are that the average per capita income for people in Africa at that stage will be between $2,000 and $3,000 per capita. The same projections would have China and India at between $30,000 and $40,000 per capita. So you got 2,000 to 3,000, 30,000 to 40,000. And countries in the so-called rich world, United States, European countries, somewhere between $90,000 and $100,000 per capita. So if you have 2 billion people living in a continent with $2,000 to $3,000 per capita, you have China and India with more people, 3 to 4 billion, 3 billion, between $30,000 and $40,000 per capita. And you have the rest of the world somewhere either north of that or in a middle class somewhere between the two countries. The two areas of the world, you have a basis for instability.
China and Nigeria are building one of Africa's largest free trade zones in the commercial capital, Lagos. VOA Africa correspondent Scott Stearns reports Chinese companies will use the facility to manufacture goods for export throughout Africa.
On the tip of the Lekki Peninsula in Lagos, Nigeria and China are building a 16,000-hectare free trade zone to develop local manufacturing and reduce Nigeria's dependence on imported consumer goods. It's one of the fastest-growing areas in Lagos State and will soon have a new deepwater port, an international airport, and new hotels as part of a 60-40 partnership between the Chinese government and Lagos State. Adeyemo Thompson is Deputy Managing Director of the Lekki Free Zone Development Company. He says construction is on schedule for Chinese shareholders that include the China Railway Construction Corporation and the China Africa Development Fund.
In accordance with the master plan and the projections we have made, I think the first phase of the zone, that's the 3,000 hectares, will probably be close to a $5 billion investment. That's included.
Africa is not a continent which is any longer isolated. It's not a place where people are uninformed. It's the fastest growing market for cellular phones. Information, as you would well know, whether it's in the townships or wherever it is now passes very quickly. And that's not just in South Africa, that's in the 53 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is not an issue which is going to go away, nor is it an issue which is trivial to those of us that live as we do here. This is a major issue which is not being confronted and which you will have to confront at some stage. And that gets into a second issue which I would like to touch on. There was established decades ago a 0.7 target for foreign aid. My colleague former colleague from this activity who is here from a different part of Stanford, as I understand, knows this. And we're now really, after a lot of speeches and a lot of activity, we're starting to get some momentum before the economic crisis of 15 months ago, which we're now maybe getting out of to a degree. But it's now not at 0.7, it's about 0.2 that we've reached. And there are a lot of statements that are still being made, but in terms of the actual money which is flowing, if you X out the amount of money that are going to the trouble spots in the world today, there is very, very little development. And in fact, the per capita contributions to Africa have been declining steadily for the last 10 or 15 years. So what is interesting is to see how the dynamic between Africa and China and Africa and India is developing. 3 years ago, for the first time, the summit meetings of the African leaders was held in Beijing. And they swore after that that it was unlikely that they would ever meet again in a Western country. Simultaneously, 400 African businessmen met in New Delhi. And each led to an understanding on the part of both the Chinese and the Indians of having a dimension of their activities geared towards Africa. Of course, there's been an Indian community in Africa, particularly in East Africa, for a long time, and there are now 750,000 Chinese in Africa. And if you're in the business that I'm in, I was raise that as a point. And the second point I would make is that in terms of China and India, in terms of their development, I was trying to get the most recent numbers, and they may be in my BlackBerry, but I haven't looked. But the numbers in 2007 were the following. There were 110,000 Chinese studying in the United States. There are now over 100,000 Indians studying in the United States. So I look around the room, I suppose it's not surprising. There were 11,200 Americans studying in China and 2,800 studying in India. This is madness. It's just madness. And it's a tragedy in terms of the potential for our young people that are still being guided to look towards Europe, to look towards graduate work in British or European universities, when the world is telling them that the dimensions have changed notably. What is the last thing that I'll touch on, which is this: historically, the Western countries were able to stay ahead, firstly because of manufacturing. Well, that got taken out and manufacturing moved to Asia. The second thing that happened after that was that in service industries, it moved to the Western countries. And now that's been taken out in terms of Asian really dominance in the service areas. And thirdly was in technology, we were able to stay ahead. But as is evident to you, and I'm sure from your colleagues and people you know, the technological advance has now shifted as well. So the challenge for our country is, what the hell is it that's going to be left for us if Asia's eating our lunch and dinner in terms of the things that we used to be able to do? And it's